Well, somehow Greg Koukl has managed to write an entire chapter about hypocrisy without ever using the words hypocrisy, hypocrite, or hypocritical. Almost sounds like maybe somebody's got a guilty conscience. Hey there, folks. Bert from the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on Greg Koukl's book, Tactics. We's up to chapter 11, and this chapter, like the last one and the next one, is supposedly about self-defeating arguments, or at least arguments that Greg thinks is self-defeating. And sadly, he seems to be on some kind of rhetorical suicide kick, so he's named this chapter Practical Suicide, even though it's really just talking about ordinary hypocrisy. But let's let Greg explain what he's talking about. Quote, some points of view fail the pragmatic test. They simply cannot work in real-life application. When a person says, I never say anything out loud, there is no logical contradiction, strictly speaking, just a practical one. He can't verbalize his conviction without refuting it. End quote. And obviously this is a contrived example to illustrate a point, but you get the gist of it. When your words say one thing and your actions say something different, that's what Greg calls practical suicide and what normal folks calls hypocrisy. But let's get to the practical examples. Quote, you see the conflict immediately in the claim, it's wrong to say people are wrong. Holding that it is wrong to find fault with others is not itself incoherent, but when you think about it, the problem occurs only when you say the statement. You would be doing the very thing you say should not be done. End quote. And this is a favorite gotcha of folks like Greg anytime anybody tries to criticize him for expressing intolerant views. You say that it's wrong to be intolerant, but when you say that, you're being intolerant of me. Poor persecuted Christians can't even go around telling folks they's evil and deserve to burn in hell. But you know what's interesting? Critics of Christianity ain't the only ones saying that it's wrong to judge folks. According to Matthew 7, 1 through 5, Jesus said, quote, judge not that you be not judged, for with the judgment you pronounce you will be judged, and with the measure you use it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when there is a log in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the log out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. End quote. And that's a handy passage to know, because if you see someone like Greg getting all judgmental, you can remind them what Jesus said. And if they says to you, well, what about you? Ain't you judging me? You can just say, well, sure, but I ain't a Christian. I don't pretend to be obeying the commandments of Jesus. And let me tell you, they really hate that. The Bible's supposed to be so they can tell other folks what to do. It ain't supposed to let other folks tell them what they has to do. Greg next tells a story about outsmarting his 2-year-old daughter, which, well done, Greg, I guess. Then he goes on to talk about Christian talk radio. Quote, during a radio broadcast, I took exception to the theology of some televangelists. I was immediately challenged by a caller who said, you shouldn't be correcting Christian teachers publicly on the radio. Then why are you calling to correct me publicly on my radio show, I asked. End quote. Zing! And notice, this time, Greg is busting a fellow believer, not an atheist. Greg was fussing about other evangelical teachers, and a caller called in to fuss about Greg, and Greg fussed right back at the caller. And by the way, ain't it a shame that there don't seem to be no all-wise, all-knowing, almighty God keeping the church in line so believers don't end up fussing at each other all the time? Just one more bit of evidence that's more consistent with God being a myth than with God being real. But back to Greg, this short little excerpt is basically all of Chapter 11 in a nutshell. Greg's got a bunch of chips on his shoulder on account of being criticized for his intolerance, and he wants to reframe each scenario in a way that makes the critic look bad, and by implication, makes Greg look like an innocent victim. And to be fair, folks has an unfortunate tendency to make this easy for Greg to do. The problem is that a lot of the time your average layperson hears Greg being intolerant, and they can tell there's something wrong there, but they has a hard time articulating exactly what the problem is. So they just go for the general case and say, well, it's wrong for you to say other folks is wrong. And boom, Greg's got you. Now, granted, we could play tit for tat and ask Greg, are you saying that it's okay to tell other folks they's wrong? And if he says yes, then ask, so why are you complaining when I tell you you're wrong? I mean, that sword cuts both ways. But I think there's a better approach. And Greg's next example will give us a good illustration of how to apply it. It's a conversation he had with someone named Lee about homosexuality, and I'm going to quote the whole conversation because there's some helpful material in there. Quote, Lee, I'm not a homosexual, but I think it's wrong to condemn anybody for anything. Greg, why are you condemning me then? Lee, what? Greg, I said, why are you condemning me if you think it's wrong to condemn people? Lee, I'm responding to the fact that a lot of Christians condemn people. Greg, I understand, and it sounds like you're condemning me because I just condemned homosexuality as wrong. Lee, yes, I am. You're supposed to love everybody. Greg, wait a minute. You're not listening to yourself. You just said it's wrong to condemn people, and now you admit you're condemning me. So I'm asking, why are you doing the very same thing that you say is wrong when I do it? Lee, no, I'm not. Lee pauses as the light slowly begins to dawn. Okay, let me put it this way. I'm not condemning you, I'm reprimanding you. Is that better? Greg, then my comments about homosexuals are simply reprimands as well. End quote. And this is the difference between an experienced debater and an ordinary layperson. Lee heard Greg on the radio saying abusive things about gay folks, and he felt immediately that this was wrong. So he called in and said so using words that expressed what he felt. He felt that the way Greg was condemning gays was wrong, and that's how he phrased it. Greg, of course, immediately saw an opportunity to exploit the vagueness and generality of Lee's complaint. Lee failed to specify exactly what kind of condemnations is wrong, and that's all the loophole Greg needed to wiggle out of it. And that's actually a pretty easy trick to pull on talk radio. You get out there and say provocative stuff and get folks all roused up, and they call in all emotional and not thinking clearly, and you can talk rings around them because you've handled most common objections before. You have prior experience, and they don't. So the thing to do here is don't fall for the trap. If something gets your dander up, just take a few breaths and calm yourself down and think about it so you can present a specific and well-reasoned objection. In this case, the crucial difference between Lee and Greg is what they was condemning folks for. Greg was condemning homosexuals for being different in ways that ain't doing any harm to anybody. They's just falling in love differently than heterosexuals do and wanting the same rights as heterosexuals has. That's it. It don't do Greg no harm nor anybody else. And he's slandering and harassing them over that harmless difference. Meanwhile, Lee was condemning Greg for defaming and harassing innocent folks over harmless differences. And refusing to tolerate abusive behavior is a very different thing than refusing to tolerate innocent folks just for being harmlessly different. What Lee was doing was justifiable, and what Greg was doing ain't. Now, typically, if you point out that someone like Greg is behaving abusively towards innocent folks, what they'll typically reply is something along the lines of, hey, that's what my religion teaches, and if you don't let me condemn gay folks, then you're violating my freedom of religion. Well, that's false. Freedom of religion don't give you the right to slander and defame and abuse innocent folks. It's the whole principle of your right to swing your fist ends at the tip of my nose. You're free to practice your religion within your own personal life, and can't nobody tell you what you're allowed to believe inside your own head, but it stops there. It ain't a license to do harm to others. And we need to remember that and bring it up whenever folks is behaving abusively towards anybody that's different in harmless ways, whether it's gay folks or trans folks or women or minorities or immigrants or whoever. And we need to be specific about why it's wrong so slippery guys like Greg can't easily wiggle out of it. People is automatically entitled to respect and tolerance by default just cause they's people. And ideas and religions and behaviors and such ain't people. So they don't automatically get the same kind of respect. And if you persistently refuse to respect other folks, you forfeit your own right to respect, and folks like Lee has the right to call you up and condemn you for your antisocial behavior. Greg's next target is what he calls moral relativism, which is ironic because Christians is some of the biggest moral relativists on the planet. Just ask them about Old Testament incest and polygamy and slavery, and listen to them explain how things has to be viewed in light of the culture and circumstances of the times and not by modern standards. Well, folks, that's moral relativism. And apologists like Greg will bend over backwards to deny that it's fair to judge God's actions in the Old Testament by modern standards of morality. But when he says that, he's basically denying that there's any universal objective moral standard that could be applied to Old Testament times just like there are today. And yet, that don't stop Greg from saying stuff like this. Quote, moral relativists, those who deny universal objective morality, are especially vulnerable to practical suicide. Whenever a relativist says you shouldn't force your morality on other people, I always ask, why not? What can he say now? He certainly can't respond, it's wrong. That option is no longer open to him. It's a contradiction, like saying, there are no moral rules, here's one. This response commits practical suicide. End quote. Greg's whole argument here is built on a false dichotomy. Either you believe in God's universal objective moral law, or else you believe that morality is just a personal subjective opinion that can't rightly be imposed on anybody else. And that's false. Morality is the accumulated practical experience of society as a whole, based on the fact that one person's actions has material consequences that affect those around them. It ain't any one person's subjective opinion, it's a collective response to objective consequences. And based on our collective experiences, we can speak objectively and say that certain behaviors is wrong without the need for any quote-unquote objective moral law or quote-unquote moral lawgiver. In fact, we can go further than that. We can say that it's wrong to use so-called objective moral laws to justify harmful behaviors like punishing folks just for being different in harmless ways. It ain't that we saying you shouldn't force your morality on other folks. It's that experience has shown that in this particular case, the so-called morality they's trying to impose is simply bigotry and abuse without any moral justification. And the fact that they has to invent a sock puppet deity to justify their bigotry just goes to show that they ain't got no genuine moral justification for it. And the bottom line here is that this is all about power. The power to force other folks to conform to arbitrary standards of appearance and behavior. That's why they call it a universal objective moral law. They want you to think that you're required to conform and obey whether you like it or not. But then when it's them that's required to submit to moral standards of conduct, suddenly it ain't objective moral law. It's quote-unquote cancel culture, political correctness, woke. They ain't interested in conforming and obeying. They's only interested in forcing other folks to conform and obey. And they's using their own superstition and bigotry to dictate what other folks has to conform to. So folks like Greg sets up this false dichotomy where only Christians has an objective moral law that's binding on non-Christians, and non-Christians only has subjective personal opinions that ain't binding on anybody else. Heads I win, tails you lose. Notice how Greg reads the scriptures here. Quote, I think that this was Paul's point in Romans 2:1 when he wrote, You have no excuse, every one of you who passes judgment, for in that which you judge another, you condemn yourself, for you who judge practice the same things. Paul argued that those who set up their own morality are still faulted by the standards of their personal moral code. End quote. But that ain't what Paul said at all. Paul was writing to Christians, not non-Christians, and he didn't say nothing about anybody setting up their own personal moral code. Paul is explicitly commanding Christians not to judge other folks. But Greg don't want to obey that command, so he interprets it as only applying to those he regards as being moral relativists. The point of having a so-called objective moral law is to force other folks to obey, not to put any limits on doing whatever it is you yourself want to do. Greg's next story is about trying to smuggle Bibles into the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Now, he don't come right out and say so, but it sounds like his attempt was unsuccessful. But at least he was able to get into a good argument with the Guard about whether or not there was freedom of religion in the Soviet Union. The Guard insisted that there was, and that they even printed their own Bibles. But bringing Bibles into the country was illegal because of the separation of church and state. Greg tried to argue that if the Bible was anti-communist propaganda and they was printing Bibles in the Soviet Union, then the government was printing anti-communist propaganda. But the Guard didn't buy it, even though it makes a good story for Greg because it makes him look like a hero. And the ironic thing in this story is that Greg is telling it in part to illustrate how bad it is to have a kind of religious freedom that ain't really religious freedom. And yet here he is in the United States today attempting to impose a standard of quote-unquote religious freedom that's just as hollow and hypocritical as the one he's denouncing in this story. And his next example kind of illustrates that. Quote, "Some years ago, the Southern Baptist Convention publicized its plans to direct its annual summer evangelistic outreach to Jews living in Chicago. It then encouraged Baptists to pray each day for Jewish individuals you know by name that they will find the spiritual wholeness available through the Messiah. The public reaction was immediate and severe." End quote. As well it should be. Targeting a specific ethnic minority for assimilation by means of aggressive proselytizing is arguably a form of genocide, and Jews in general don't take too kindly to that. They don't like being the target of it because it's happened too often before. And the Southern Baptists should have known better. They took a big PR hit off of that one and it hurt them. So naturally, Greg tries to spin this as yet another case of Christians being persecuted hypocritically. Quote, "The rabbis were incensed that Christians were trying to change the religious conviction of Jews. Yet their antidote was for the Christians to abandon their religious convictions about evangelism and adopt the rabbis' view, evangelize only those who have no religion." End quote. But Greg is overstating his case here. Nobody's asking Christians to change their beliefs about evangelism. All they's asking for is for Christians to have more respect for other folks in how they practice their religion. Religious freedom don't give you the right to target other folks for aggressive proselytizing, especially when they are an ethnic minority who's repeatedly been the target of similar genocidal efforts in the past. Is it okay to talk about your religious beliefs? Sure. Is it okay to criticize the religious belief of others? Sure. If folks is going to believe silly, irrational things, it's okay to call them things silly and irrational and give your reasons. Ideas and dogmas ain't people, so they ain't got no inherent right to respect and tolerance. But you have to respect the people who hold those beliefs and acknowledge their right to believe in them if they wants to. And targeting specific individuals by name for aggressive proselytizing crosses the line. And that's it for Chapter 11. Greg's presenting it as if he was just critiquing logical fallacies and hypocrisy in other folks' arguments, but his examples make it abundantly clear that what he really wants here is to be free to be intolerant of other folks without being criticized for it. And he ends up being guilty of his own quote-unquote practical suicide. He thinks it's okay for him to condemn others, but he complains when others condemn him. And that's exactly his definition for so-called practical suicide. Gotta be more careful calling them kettles black, I reckon. Anyways, I'm sure there's lots more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time, Greg continues his fascination with morbid chapter titles with a chapter entitled Sibling Rivalry and Infanticide. Based on what we've seen so far, I'm sure it'll tell us more than Greg intends for it to say, so stay tuned. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.